Morning. It is good to see everybody here at the Lenore City Church of Christ. Thanks for coming out to worship with us this morning. This morning is kind of a special lesson in the sense of this was a requested lesson by some of our youth. And, it's always interesting when you kind of probe, the young people. What are the things they're wanting to hear? What are the things, they are looking for? And this kind of topic comes up over and over and over and over again. And they want to know, how can Christians influence the world? But also, how can Christians be influenced by the world? Because, what young people notice is when, adults or parents may say, I can participate in something, be a part of something, and because I'm an adult, I can handle it, and it's not going to influence me. But you, as a young child, cannot be a part of, cannot partake in, because you're young, and it's going to corrupt you, and it's going to, be a bad influence on you. And, and when we start seeing kids start behaving, we start, asking, well, what are they listening to? Where are they hearing this? Where are they getting this from, right? I remember the first time my mom heard me say a word that I probably shouldn't have said. And the first thing, where'd you hear that? And I so badly wanted to say, from you, Sorry, Mom. If you're listening, my mom doesn't normally, but growing up, our life was such that, even though we went to church, even though we were Christians, we were very much a part of the world. Got to watch whatever we wanted to watch, got to do whatever we wanted to do. The people I was allowed to hang out with, those kinds of things, they all were influences on me. And so, what I want to do this morning is talk a little bit about our influence, the good, the bad, and the ugly. Can Christians have a positive influence over the world? Can we be a force for good? Absolutely. How? We're going to look at some of that. There's the bad, meaning there are things that Christians do, sometimes unintentionally, because we are still what? We are still human. We are still imperfect. And so there are times where we will strive to do what is right, but a situation comes and you make bad decisions. And so that's not good. It's bad. And then there's the ugly, where Christians kind of have that same mentality that some parents have with their kids is, you know what, I'm allowed to be a part of these things, take part in these things, and they don't influence me, and yet we really don't see how much they actually do. And I think the fact that our teens and our young people are constantly asking, why do parents get to say things like, hey, I'm old enough and I'm mature enough to handle this, and yet the things that they say they're old enough and mature enough to handle, the teens or our young people are actually seeing the things that they say they're old enough to handle actually influence their life and to be a part of. I remember having a friend of mine who was a fellow preacher. Unfortunately, he's no longer a preacher. Unfortunately, he's no longer even a Christian. And I'm going to tell you, I saw it happen before it happened. And one of the major things, and this isn't, once again, there's not always like, if you do this, here's automatically your next step, okay? So we got to be careful with some of that stuff. But I remember him telling me about some of the movies and shows he was watching. And I'll try to be careful being other people's judge over entertainment, right? I'm sure there are things that I watch that there are people who are even more, it all dependent on, we got to be careful. But I think there are some things that are straight wrong to be a part of. All right, there are certain themes or certain things that go on in movies that you cannot, as a Christian, in my mind, justify why you watch X, Y, Z. It just, to me, you can't do it. There are things that, maybe depending on maturity, well, you know what? People are going to do it anyway. So I'm talking to him, and he's watching some things that if I name some of these things, you'd be like, some of your mouth may drop, like, what? And some of you may go, hey, what's so bad about that? And is what it is. And I said, why do you watch this stuff? What's the appeal? He said, let me tell you. I watch it because I know people in the world watch it. So therefore, for me to have an in with the people in the world, I'm going to watch the same things they're watching so that I can have conversations with them about it. Okay, nice sliding that one in there. And I just asked the question. I said, so if you're really using this, if that's your true intent, to use this as an evangelistic opportunity, which, be careful to say that, what are you going to do when you actually sit down and study with this person and you start getting into passages that talk about avoiding the sins that you're so freely partaking in, watching, and consuming in your life? What happens there? Where's the rub? What do you start saying? What do you start saying to these people when, the Bible talks about the things that go into you, right? Be careful of the things you put into your mind and into your, we sing the song, be careful little eyes what you see. Be careful big eyes what you see, right? Be careful adult eyes what you see. If you don't think for a moment the things that you watch or that you're mature enough and your kids are not, sometimes I think our kids are more mature in those aspects than we are. There are times like, hey, Dad, you really think we should be listening to that word? Sometimes we get softened to it or hardened to things. Well, we hear that all the time. They don't. So when they hear it, they're kind of stinging. And it doesn't even faze us sometimes anymore. Right? And now, I don't want to harp on this guy too much, but I watched his downfall happen because it was an excuse like that in every area of his life. He had some kind of good intention behind it. Well, now he's divorced from his wife, living with another woman, not following Christ, living the life that he filled his mind with. That doesn't always happen, but it does. So here's our question. How can we balance being in the world but not of the world? Because there is a part of life where you can't escape things, right? If you try to escape things, if you try to just never have anything ever bad influence you or your kids, you have to do what? Go find a hole, right? 500 feet in the ground and bury yourself and only come out for food and water. And even then, on your way to the market, what are you probably going to see and hear? So you are in the world, and you are going to be exposed to things. Your kids are probably exposed to things in schools that you may not even imagine being exposed to at your age. And so sometimes we have this mentality, well, they're already hearing it, they're already seeing it, so what's the big deal of also filling our house with it? Well, I would say that if you're asking that question, there are some things you need to consider. Because, yes, they're already seeing it and hearing it, but they're also going to need the balance, right? They're going to need probably more than the balance of seeing the good and the pure and the wholesome too, right? If they're constantly filled and constantly seeing things and you are constantly, being a part of the world and in the world. I remember a friend of mine, he was from Meadville. He was struggling with language. He was in the military, so he struggled with language. Where he worked, it was in one of those places where it's just second nature for these guys. They say words that they don't even think of anymore. It's just a part of their language. And so he did an experiment. He took for 6 months, he decided that in his own personal life, all of his entertainment, all things he was going to watch, all things he was going to read, all the things he was going to be a part of, he knew he couldn't escape it completely. But if it was as much control as he had, he wasn't going to watch anything, listen to anything, be a part of anything that had that kind of language because he wanted to defeat it. So he had a goal for 6 months. In 4 weeks, he got to a point where he says, I probably have not used foul language, bad language, in days now. And he went on, and he continued that. He continued to push that onto his kids. now to a point where he just preached a sermon on it. He's a friend of mine. He's not a preacher, but he preaches at times. He just preached a whole sermon about how he just made up in his mind. And I mean, he spent 40 years of his life with language being a part of his vocabulary, bad language. And in 4 weeks, he was able to get rid of it by using all of his time that he had not to be influenced by it further. See, we can as Christians go, you know what? We're being exposed to it anyway. What's the big deal? There's a difference in being exposed and exposing yourself. Right? You're going to be exposed by walking in the marketplace, but if you willingly choose what's going to come out eventually. Why does Jesus say the things that you put in, where do they start? They start here. Well, how do they get here? It's something that you're constantly putting in, right? You know, bad language, I'm just using bad language as an example, doesn't just come from nowhere. It's taught. It is learned. And it becomes a practice, okay? So there's a balance, right? We got to be in the world but not of the world. And so let's go to Galatians chapter 5. If you have your Bibles, we're going to be in Galatians 5 and we're going to be in Ephesians 5, back and forth. And I'm not going to read all of this. What I want you to do is with your families or with your kids, or maybe it's just you got a spouse, or maybe it's just you, write these passages down because I'm not going to go through them all. Read them with your family and see, okay, let's line up how we spend our time, the things that we participate in, and what these verses say, and ask ourselves, are we being more influenced by the world, or are we influencing the world around us in a good way? Which one's happening more often than not? Right? We can constantly say, well, you don't understand, Jesse. Look at the environment I'm a part of. You know what? Why don't you try to do the opposite? And I remember, and Lester's told me this before as well, you can live in such a way where people know, hey, I don't use that language, I don't talk like that. And so you know what they do if they respect you and you've built a good rapport with them, you're a good worker, hard worker, guess what they try not to do around you? They try not to use that language around you. I mean, I can count almost everybody in here who has at least given me an example of, hey, I'm very proud that in my work environment, people don't like to use that language around me because they know how I talk. We've got several people in here who have told me things like that. And I'm proud that we stand on those moral grounds, okay? Because that's influencing people. They're seeing something different. But look at Galatians 5. Look at verse 16. He says, but I say, walk by the Spirit, and you will not gratify the desires of the flesh. So here's one of those balance things. You've got to be in the world, but not of the world. But if you constantly are doing the things of the flesh, what can you not be walking by? Paul just says that they're going in two different directions. Right? If you end up in California, you cannot be in New York, right? Why? They're on opposite sides of the country. And you can't be going towards both places at the same time. You're either going in one direction or you're going in the other. And there's a lot of people who would like to think there's this beautiful middle ground when it comes to following God and following the world. 1 foot in, 1 foot out. And I remember hearing the cliche, all right, what is the cliche about the fence? Who owns the fence? If you're trying to keep 1 foot in the world and 1 foot in Christ, you're on the fence and Satan owns the fence. He is the master of thinking. He is the master of getting people thinking. And that we have a whole denominations built around the theology that God just wants you where you are and wants to keep you where you are. That there's nothing God is looking for in transformation from you, in giving, in sacrificial living, that you're good the way you are, you're going to be good the way you are, stay the way you are. And that's okay. Well, here's what Paul says. For the desires of the flesh are against the Spirit, and the desires of the Spirit are against the flesh. For these are opposed to each other to keep you from doing the things you want to do. Do you hear that? What do you want to do are the things you will do. My friend who decided he no longer wanted to speak bad language, he thought it was going to take him a whole lot longer than it did. He didn't realize that all he needed to do was just have a desire to get away from it. And his desire couldn't just be, well, I want to. He had to put effort behind. He had to walk that way. He had to put energy towards. And you know what people started doing around him? They started changing around him. He had a colleague who he worked with who was also a claimed Christian, right? Who used that same language. And when he finally found the one person who stood up and said, you know what, I'm no longer going to talk like this, he started changing him. And then there was a 3 or 4, little group of them who all made up in their minds, we're going to change this work environment. And I'm going to make sure this work environment is as Christ-like as I possibly can, because who wants to sit and listen to that stuff all day? Who wants to be a part of it? So if you want to change your environment, you've got to change you first. But for you to change first, all that we're talking about in Galatians and Ephesians, you first must be changed by Christ. Right? Without Jesus and without understanding the gospel, right? That without Jesus, could you change it all? You can make slight changes, right? I'm not saying there are people who are not Christians, who are not good people. But when you talk about a fundamental mind, heart, worldview change, it cannot be done outside of Christ in a way that puts hope outside of this world, right? And so we have to be changed by Christ. And for us to be influenced by Jesus, guess who we need to be putting into our mind? Jesus needs his life, his actions, his words need to become a part of our life if we are going to influence others. And, we ask ourselves, why do I struggle with this? How much Jesus do you put in you? And how much of the world do you put in you? I would suggest if you want to change the way that you talk and act and behave because you analyze yourself, right? We're all got to look in the mirror. I can't look in your mirror, right? You look in your mirror, I look in mine. I got enough, right? I got enough that I'm, trying to change in my own life. Look at what you put in your life. Look at what you put in your heart. So watch what he says. So let's go to this next part. Let's skip over to Ephesians 5 now. Look at verse 3. He says, sexual immorality, all impurity, or covetousness must not even be named among you, as is proper among the saints. Paul is indicating there is a lifestyle that is proper for those who are Christians, and there is a lifestyle that is not proper for those who are Christians. Why is it so hard to get Western American Christians to understand that? I'm not saying other places don't struggle, but I think we struggle with it more because we've got entertainment literally in our palms. Anything you want to watch or to hear or to be a part of, click of a button. Click of a button. And now internet speed is so fast. Have you ever noticed that if it delays more than 3 seconds, the world is ending, right? The world is ending. If what I want to get to does not load in under 3 seconds, I got to get a new phone. Why don't we have Wi-Fi 6 in this building, right? But we have access to information. That's what I'm going to get. So fast and so quick and so abundant. But what do we choose to use it for? It can be a source of good, right? Well, a lot of times we talk about technology and it's evil from Satan, from the devil, and it can be. But it also can be a source of good because there are so many things out there that are good for your mind, good for your head, and if you're just trying to go to mainstream places to find it, it's getting harder and harder and harder. People are like, well, I can't find it. Well, get off mainstream. There is good stuff out there. You just got to find it, right? And so here's what he says. For you may be sure of this, that everyone who is sexually immoral or impure or is covetous, that is an idolater, has no inheritance in the kingdom of Christ and God. Let no one deceive you with empty words, for because of these things. And when I heard the justification of my friend of why he watches the things that he watches, to me they were just empty words. They were him trying his darndest to be able to do what he desires and wants to do and cover it with righteousness. Cover it with righteousness. What does even Satan himself try to disguise himself as? As a child of light, right? He tries to make you think that the things that you know, everybody knows. I mean, everybody knows what is right and wrong. If you've been a Christian for a year, you know what is right, what is wrong. Even if you're not a Christian and haven't been a Christian, there is an innate inside of us, like little kids understand, hey, if I come up and I take this toy from you, what are they going to say? No, that's mine. You can't steal. Right? What if I come up and punch you? Is that okay? No. Why? Because that hurts. That's wrong. There is a basic instinct that we know what is right and wrong, but through life and circumstances, we allow our hearts to become calloused and start thinking, knowing that things are not okay, we start saying, you know what? They're really not that bad. And then they become really not that bad too. Well, why would you question this practice or this decision, or this show, or this movie at all? How dare you? And then we start throwing the, how dare you judge me? Well, you know, I've come to a place where when I talk to somebody about their life, if it's just coming from a place of judgment, I should not say anything. Right? If I'm just trying to be more holier than thou, and trying to show how, hey, you know, in my house, and in my life, and in my, you know, we do this, and you should really be more like me. If that's my goal when speaking to people, you're right. Why people go, I'm not going to listen to you. I mean, you know, but if it is, man, I love you. I really do. But I really think this being a part of your life, I mean, you can go and find myriads of reasons why you think it's okay and justify it, and I'm not going to argue with you, right? You can't argue. Someone says, I'm using this for an evangelistic tool. It's kind of got liar, right? You know, you just kind of let people believe what they want to believe, but if you truly love someone, you go to them and say, is this really what's best for you? Is this really how you are going to influence the world around you, right? You know, when Jesus says we are to be lights in the world, how can you be a light when you look like everything else? Right? How can you be a light when you are exactly the same as everything else that everyone sees around you? If there's no difference in you, right? The 1 Peter 3 can't even come in where people are asking, hey, what's the hope that is in you if they never see it? Right? Who is this Jesus you talk about day by day? You know, we sing that song. But if you're not talking about Jesus day by day, they can't ask you, who is this Jesus you talk about? Because he's not being talked about. And so there is a conscious decision to walk by the Spirit. And Paul says you can't do that if you're partaking in the unfruitful works of darkness. It just can't happen. You cannot be a light walker. Keep reading. Look, he says, therefore, do not become partners with them. This is verse 7. For at one time you were darkness. So you used to be that way. If you after becoming a Christian, if your life still looks like your pre-Christ life, Paul's saying there's a problem. There's an issue. You were once, now you're not. He says, for at one time you were darkness, but now you are light in the world, in the Lord. Walk as children of light, for the fruit of the light is found in all that is good and right and true. Imagine if that was our filter for everything that we watch or do. Is it good? Is it right? Is it true? That's a good filter, isn't it? I mean, that's a easy, 3 simple thing to consider. Whatever you partake in, whatever you decide to do, and we're not just talking about entertainment. How do you spend your, Friday nights, your Saturday nights? How do you spend your, when you're with your work buddies? How do you spend your time when you're just at home by yourself? When you're on the computer by yourself and no one's watching. What is good? What is right? What is true? And we have a hard time influencing people around us because we spend so much of our time fighting the influences that we have so freely brought into our life. We've opened the flood. As I said, there are some you can't avoid, right? You can't go hide in a mountain, right? You can't go be monks. The desire's there, right? There's the desire for me to go buy a cabin in the woods and get food on a draw line, someone loaded up hundreds of miles down the road and me just kind of come up, as long as there's Wi-Fi 6, right? Up in that cabin. But there's the desire, because sometimes you get out and you're like, you know what your kids are going to have to see, you know what your kids are going to have to hear, you know what your kids are going to have to go through, and you just want to save them from it. Now, here's the cool thing. We won't always do what is right. Right? We won't always make the right decisions. I mean, just look at your life in the last 6 months. Are there times where you haven't made the right decision? And somebody saw it. You can either take that time and use it for further bad and go, you know what, they've already saw me once, I'm already exposed, I'm not perfect, and you don't even try. Or there's the, you know what, let me tell you about Jesus, who, yes, I failed, and you know that's not who I am. I didn't try to do that. You know I normally don't partake in that. And I got caught. I got caught up like everybody else. That's why I rely upon my Lord. When I do fall short, when I do make mistakes, Jesus is there with his blood, and he forgives me of all of my sins. You want to be a part of you know what? We can strive together to be better. And once again, Christianity isn't just about making good behavior children and good boys and girls. If that's not the goal, that is the result. The result is to take people from the kingdom of darkness and transfer them into the kingdom of Jesus. And the result of being in his kingdom and being affected by grace and mercy of God is that you would want to follow the one who led you to this path, right? We are to walk in the footsteps of Jesus. Because we know where he is going to the Father. And if we want to go to the Father, who do we have to follow? We want to follow Christ, right? And we see the result that Jesus had in the world. Now, here's another thing about influence. And we'll get here in a second. Will everybody respond good to your good influence? Is how people respond to you the only litmus test for how good you have been as a Christian? Because if that were the case, how well did Jesus do? Did everybody respond to Jesus in a way that was positive and profitable? And hey, Jesus doesn't like Pharisaical self-righteousness. So the Pharisees took that and said, you know what, well, let's stop being self-righteous around Jesus. No, they amplified that, right? And that will happen, right? There are people who find out, oh, you're a Christian. And their life's goal, right, then and there, if they work with you, is to try to trip you up, is to try to make it harder for you, is to try to throw stumbling blocks over you. That will happen. But that can't deter us, can it? That can't deter us, because look at Ephesians chapter 5 and verse 1. Why do we do this? Therefore, be imitators of God as beloved children. You know what? When it comes down to it, you are not changing your life and transforming your life just so you can be a good influence. You see the love of God. You realize how powerful it was in your life, how bright that light is of grace and mercy, and you look to the life of Jesus and you just see, I would want to be around this kind of person, and that's the kind of person that I want to be. I want to be as much like God as I can. And the result of that, then, is by you changing yourself and intentionally changing yourself, people are going to naturally what? They're going to naturally notice. And I'm going to ask the question, this is for the teens, or kind of answer their question a little bit. If people aren't naturally noticing that something's different in your life, is there? They ask the question, how can we influence the world? Or how can we be influenced by the world? And I would like to ask the question to the adults in the room, those who claim Christ, those who claim that Jesus came and died for their sins, the people who just partake in the Lord's Supper because of the sacrifice that Jesus made, the death that he died for you, who influences you more, the world or Christ? Then when you answer that, I want you to ask the people around you, who do you think influences me more, the world or Christ? It's a scary question to ask, isn't it? Because we all know there's imperfections, right? We all know we're not perfect at it. But what are we striving towards? He says, look at verse 2, and walk in love as Christ loved us and gave himself up a fragrant offering and a sacrifice to God. We can be a real driving force in our culture and community. But I think where we have fallen short as Christians is there's twofold. One, Christians say, you know what? It's too hard to engage the world. And so they do what? I mean, they keep to themselves. I'm not saying homeschool's bad, because I think homeschool is great. But think about it. Let's say we do homeschool, we start working from home, we start not getting involved in any activities, we don't get outside what happens? Right? Now, I'm a very big proponent in kids need to be trained before thrown out into the lion's den, okay? Right? You want to be them as lights in the world, but they're still working on their light. Who's going to influence them more? So I'm not trying to say homeschool is bad, but I'm saying if we are constantly always separate from the world and we kind of close ourselves off and close all the doors, then who are we ever influencing? But there's the other hand. Let's just go out and do everything the world has to do. And on the other hand, you lose time to build that light. You lose time to focus on the love of God. You lose time to build up your own, Christian life and your Christian walk. And so there's a balance, right? There's a balance to all that we do. And I'm going to end with one verse in Philippians chapter 2. And I think this is kind of the things we need to consider. Therefore, this is verse 12, Philippians 2, verse 12. Therefore, my beloved, as you have always obeyed, so now, not only as in my presence, but much more in my absence, work out your salvation with fear and trembling. For it is God who works in you both to will and to work for his good pleasure. I think verse 14 is a good passage for us to sit on. Do all things without grumbling or disputing. One of the number one things, in my opinion, that hurt the cause of Christ today is grumbling and complaining Christians. We're going to get on Facebook, and we're just going to tell everybody everything we hate, everything we're against. We're going to complain. I don't like this, I don't like that, I don't like this. What do you like? What do you like? Right? The Jews in the wilderness. Oh, God, it's so hard to live in this world. We got to go through the wilderness. I want to go back to Egypt. We have better food. We have better this. And if there's one thing that drove Moses and God insane, it was people who were just rescued by God, brought out of slavery, and being rescued and brought to the promised land, and they sat and complained about it. How can you be a light of hope, joy, peace, and yet you spend your life... Sorry. Look at verse 15. That you may be blameless and innocent, children of God, without blemish in the midst of a crooked and twisted generation, among, I love this verse, whom you shine as lights in the world. Who did Jesus leave back? Right, Jesus left this earth. He's still living. He's still master of heaven. Sits at the right hand of God. But who did he leave in this world?
The Holy Spirit.
To be the lesser lights. Right? We are to have the light of Christ in us. God dwelling in us. Right? Through his Spirit. God dwelling in us. And that we may go out and be Christ-like in this world. To be little temples. Right? Little tabernacles. Little people that have God living in us. They need to see it, though. They need to see it, but they also need to hear it. And so this morning, as a Christian's influence, the good, the bad, and the ugly, the good is when Christianity is done right, you can study history, and it just absolutely changes the culture in which it lives. It absolutely, you look at America, you look at the foundation of America, right? And we can go and argue about, but you look at a lot of their principles, guess what book they came from? Guess what book they came from? It came from this. Where do most of your universities come from? Where do most of your hospitals come from? Where do most of your orphanages come from? Where do most of your, shelters come from? They all come from Christians who understand that God so loved the world that He sent His only begotten Son, that whoever believes in Him shall not perish, but also that love that has influenced us must go out and affect others. You cannot claim to love God and not love your brother, right? As you love the least of these, Jesus says, you learn to love me. So this morning, I ask you the question, first, are you a Christian? Is the light of God living in your life? Have you had your sins washed away? Right? You got to take care of the sin problem. You got to take care of the sin problem. And Jesus came and He died and He shed His blood, and that blood is freely accessible to all. All who would submit and obey and to have their sins washed away in baptism. Right? He purifies you. He cleanses you. He makes you a clean vessel where He can come and live and dwell in you. And yet, sometimes we take that gift as if God isn't with us and in us and living through us. That's what Paul just said to the church of Philippi. It is God who is at work in you. And I would ask you, look at the work that you partake in on a daily basis. Look at the things that you are a part of. Do you really feel like it's God working in you? Is it God's works? Is it God's fruits? Is it God's, life? Is it having the same results? So this morning, if you're not a Christian, why not? But if you are a Christian and you want to influence this world, it cannot be living in darkness. It cannot be by living like everybody else. It's not that we're better. It's that we have submitted to a holy God and we have been changed. We have been changed and we have been transformed. And I ask you, how's your transformation coming? Some of us are in early stages, right? Some of us have been in early stages for many years. But break out of that. Break out of that. Let God's love fill you and go fill it with others. This morning, if there's anything that you need, we ask that you come forward as we stand together and as we sing.